Barkha, thank you very much indeed for joining us on News at 10. And we should begin our conversation with all of our condolences, because you have just lost your father to this terrible disease.
Thank you, Julie. In 25 years of being a journalist, it's not often that I'm at a loss for words, and yet today is one of those moments. And despite that, and despite the grief and the gutted sense, sort of sentiment that defines me at this moment, and forgive me if I'm not my most articulate, I just felt that it was important to come and speak in any case, despite the fact that what was a national mourning has now become a period of personal mourning. Because in some ways, Julie, I became the story that I've been reporting for weeks and weeks and weeks now. In fact, since 2020, when the pandemic first erupted, whether it was the difficulty of getting an ambulance to take my father to hospital, whether it was the discovery that that ambulance was not really an ambulance at all, but that it was a rickety old car repurposed as a fly-by-night service, that it did not have any paramedics in it, that it did not have an oxygen cylinder that worked as it should have, that I had to then beg for an ICU bed, even with my privilege and my connections. And then finally, when my sister and I went to cremate him today, at the cremation ground, there was no space. There was a fight that took place between three families for one spot, just to say goodbye to somebody you've loved. There isn't space at the cremation grounds. And it seemed to me as the news came home that I report this happening to other people every day. And in some ways, it becomes incumbent upon me to be able to come here and speak in this moment of grief. Because as a journalist, when I'm standing on the other side of the camera, I do interview people who've been just as devastated and just as desolate as I feel today. And so that's why when you all reached out, I just felt I had to come here and tell you how my story is a metaphor for what's happening in India, and yet it's not. I just want to qualify that if it was so difficult for me, and as a daughter, of course, that grief is incomparable. But the fact is that I'm an upper middle class Indian, maybe even by all accounts, a wealthy Indian. I'm an Indian who had access to a hospital. I'm an Indian who, for my father, had access to an ICU bed. Most people that I'm reporting on are dying at the gates of hospitals that are shutting their doors to patients. Most people I'm reporting on are being made to sign consent forms that aren't consent forms at all, wherein people are being made to say, if somebody we love dies because the hospital did not have a ventilator or did not have an oxygen, it would not be the liability of either the state or the hospital. Most people aren't even getting ambulances to carry their dead. And people that I've most recently reported on are now heading to gurudwaras, which is, of course, the Sikh place of worship. And these gurudwaras have now started offering, they used to offer, feasts and banquets to those who are hungry. They now offer something called an oxygen langar, which basically means if you're starved, not for food, but for oxygen, you can go to this gurdwara, you can sit in your car, you can plead for help, and a cylinder will come to you to your window, and volunteers are helping you get 1 air of breathing time. So yes, my personal tragedy is crushing, but it's not what millions of Indians are going through.
But Barkha, how has it come to this in India? In a country that, from all perspectives, from so many perspectives, has been on the up, that people thought would be able to cope, where we've seen images from earlier in the pandemic where it seemed that India was across this and coping?
Well, Julie, India declared victory against the COVID-19 pandemic far too early. India got complacent, and India also got callous. And we got complacent because we thought the worst was behind us. We got callous because through this carnage, and I use the word with responsibility, because when you see mass cremations of the kind that I've seen at the cremation grounds and graveyards I've been to, there's blood on the streets. People are just dying, and they're dying not necessarily from the virus. They're dying because the health system has collapsed and isn't giving them what is their right as citizens to have. And through this carnage, we've had election rallies, we've had electioneering take place, we've had hundreds of thousands of people gather in mass congregations, we've had religious congregations, we've had India's election commission now been accused by one of the courts for being responsible for murder. And yet on this day that I talked to you, on a day when I cremated my father, on a day when thousands of Indians would have gone through a similar tragedy, we've had election rallies taking place. That is callous. And finally, there has been incompetence. Why was our vaccine rollout program so slow? We lost critical 2 months. We did not universalize fast enough. We gifted away and exported our vaccines. We went from over-centralizing this program to now leaving our states to fend for themselves. So it's a combination of complacency, callousness, and incompetence.
Barkha, you know, of course, there'll be very many families here in Britain with such close ties to India watching in utter horror at what is unfolding there. What message do you have for those families and indeed for Britain? We know help has arrived in some measure today. What would your message be to Britain and indeed the wider world?
Don't treat this as our problem alone. One of the necessary short-term responses to the pandemic was to shut borders. I understand the need for countries to put the interest of their citizens first, but the virus is this creature that travels through crevices and under doors and over skies and in aeroplanes and across porous borders. And we live in a world where we cannot be separated indefinitely by borders. We've all got families and lovers and friends and parents and siblings, and we're a global community. And if this erupts out of control in India, this is going to hit the world sooner or later. So for the sake of science, for the sake of the world, but also for the sake of the unprecedented humanitarian crisis that I think we're going to see unfold here, Julie, over the next few weeks. And I just want to add a point here. My reporting trips to the cremations and graveyards very clearly tell me that there's a huge gap between what the official numbers are telling us and the actual situation on the ground. There have been times when I've been to a funeral site where 100 bodies have been cremated in one site, and that entire state might be reporting half of that or even a fraction of that. So there is an unprecedented humanitarian crisis, and sooner or later, if it doesn't touch the world's conscience, it will impact the world's security. So for either of these reasons, India needs help, and the world should focus on getting us as many vaccines and oxygen tankers as is possible.
Barkha, we thank you for your reporting, but we also acknowledge that you're a daughter tonight as well as a journalist. So we send you all of our condolences and very many thanks for your insight. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for having me.